Transfer of power to central bankers canned, coalition forced to move, and Argentina demonstrates neoliberal descent into fascism. Coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 29th of February 2024 on a leap year.
A very rare occasion that this is filmed on a leap year. It's the first time ever, I think.
Yeah,
out of
probably.
over 700 episodes.
So, special day, we got good news. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me is Craig Isherwood, Citizens Party leader and founder. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be discussing news from Canberra. We've got people on the ground there, and a historic occasion where we are almost ready to declare victory on defeating the removal of the Section 11 power, which gives the government power to tell the Reserve Bank what to do in a critical situation if it comes to a conflict between the two. Yeah. So we're very close to that. And then stay tuned, we're going to discuss an example being Argentina of what happens when you let the economists dictate what happens in the nation.
Yeah, the neoliberal economists like we're suffering here. Yeah.
Today as well. Now, before we get into it, don't forget to hit the like button and make a comment below. Share this in any way you can, as widely as possible to get the word out. And subscribe, ring the notification bell. We put up a video a couple of days ago, which we're going to play here again today, of Mr. Albanese reacting to the threat of his bill not going through. And those updates will be, you'll be alerted of that if you ring the bell. And you can also see the box below to donate. We need people's support to keep these campaigns going. And another way you can help also is by subscribing to our regular weekly Australian alert service, where we produce all this material in depth.
It's very, very important. It's a subject close to my heart, Elisa, because I take in the money and spend the money. I do the books. So, and I know that we've just heard that there's another hearing coming up in Bribey Island. So Robbie will be going
Tom Price and then Bribey Island.
Yeah, look at Robbie's going to go to
April,
Tom Price, which is out in the middle of Whoop Whoop, if we say, and then come back that's in March next month, starting next month. And then back to Bribey Island in Queensland. So, I mean, he's going to literally clocking up the frequent flyer points to represent. And look, these are incredibly important to be on the ground here. We get to talk to not just the senators, but their staffers. We're able to update them, brief them. I mean, these senators are very busy. Yeah. And for us to have the opportunity to be there on the ground, say, look, did you realise this? Well, this has just happened. How about this? Then they get fully informed in a way that you can't necessarily get access to them when they're in Parliament. Yeah,
at last week's Kingston hearing, I mean, Robbie organised some of the witnesses that hadn't previously been arranged to come along, the people from Cooper.
So our role on the ground is really important. It's not a cheap thing. And Matt Canavan, the Senate's committee leader, thanked us for our involvement and did recognise the fact that we are paying every expense in being at these hearings. And look, it's what we do. We're there to represent the viewers, the people that support us, our membership, in order to make sure that our ideas, the ones that you support, are put forward to the leadership of our country. That's what you're funding. So donations are not just going to the ether. They're used to literally fund our campaign work.
So we'll now give you some of the runs on the board from that work. In our first topic, transfer of power to central bankers canned, coalition forced to move. So of course we are talking about the legislation, the RBA reforms bill that Mr. Chalmers is pushing, and of course Albanese as well, to try to get through. It's all meant to be, these reforms are meant to be in place by the 1st of July this year, but they are hitting roadblock after roadblock. Of course, there was a committee inquiry announced at the end of last year into this matter, because particularly the Greens had expressed concern about, there's a number of elements, of course, we've documented extensively that we don't like and others don't like about this legislation. But the first and foremost issue was recommendation number 1, which was to take away what some have described as a reserve power. It can only be used, it's quite difficult and onerous to use. It can only be used in an emergency situation where the economic crisis perhaps dictates that the government can overrule or override the Reserve Bank decision-making on monetary policy.
And of course, you've got the blame for that, Elisa, because of your submission that you put into the Senate inquiry, because this issue was never raised in any paper except the fact that you highlighted this issue, or part of this issue, in our submission to this committee. And it's interesting that not one submission to this committee recommended the removal of Section 11, yet it was the first recommendation that the committee came out with. And that's what raised a lot of questions. Where did this thing come from? Absolutely.
We're going to show some of the highlights from the hearings in a moment with videos that will intersect that big question and which really brought things to a head. That hearing last Thursday, and that was happening as we were taping the show last week, which we knew would be most interesting, but that really brought to a head and we'd already, as we reported last week, we'd already heard whispers that the coalition were thinking about opposing this legislation. And we were holding out hope that that would indeed be the case, but that hearing absolutely sealed the deal, that hearing of the Senate Economics Committee. And so what I want to do is show first, before we get to the committee hearing, a video of question time 2 days ago of the Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, reacting to a question from the Greens MP Max Chandler-Mather, where he laid out what happened in that hearing and said, what do you have to say about this reaction to your bill? And look, this is an absolute little foot stomp from Mr Albanese, because the opposition had agreed with the government all along over an entire year that they would rubber stamp this, because that's part of the bipartisan consensus on neoliberalism. Both major parties have signed up since 1983 to deregulation, privatisation, stripping the real economy of any powers of government to actually intervene for the benefit and the common good of the people. And therefore, because the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, and the coalition as a whole has suddenly withdrawn their support for this, Albo ain't happy. So let's roll that clip.
And I give the call to the member for Griffith.
Question to the Prime Minister. Since the Reserve Bank review, the Greens have opposed the government's proposal to remove its power to protect renters and mortgage holders from unreasonable interest rate rises. Former Prime Minister Keating and 2 former RBA governors have publicly agreed with us that big political decisions like interest rate rises require political accountability. Will you admit your government was wrong to try and give up its power to overrule unreasonable interest rate increases and back the Greens' change to the bill?
Order. Order. Prime Minister has the call.
What's surprising here isn't that the Greens political party have that position. It's that the Liberal Party, or some of them, are saying that they'll back you on that as well. We'll see what happens in the Senate. But we had an RBA review, and the government's response is all about reinforcing the independence of the Reserve Bank. The independence of the Reserve Bank to deal...
Order. The member for Hume.
To deal with monetary policy, and the government's responsibility through the budget to deal with fiscal policy. And we want them, of course, to work together, which is what we have been doing, which is why we produced the first budget surplus in 15 years. Now, Senator McKim has shown through his sniping from the sidelines that he knows nothing about how the RBA functions, and he doesn't understand the review. And he has found a kindred spirit in the Shadow Treasurer. The Shadow Treasurer was consulted by the Treasurer for more than a year. And he has never mentioned once, any proposal to override power as a concern. This only shows that it's all about political posturing and opportunism and not considered.
The member for Hume is going to cease interjecting for the remainder of this answer, or to be warned.
Not a considered view about the policy. What is clear is that the Shadow Treasurer not only cannot get a question to the Treasurer in question time, he has no authority amongst his colleagues who are trying to go down a populist route. Now, the Treasurer has done his best to be bipartisan,
The member for
reasonable.
Groom will cease interjecting.
The light shines upon the member for Groom, Mr Speaker, but it doesn't make him any brighter. Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr
Just
Speaker.
Order. Members on my left. Just going to ask the Prime Minister. Just the member for Barker. Just going to ask the Prime Minister to withdraw that comment.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
To assist the House. Order. On my left.
Senator Hume has said this, which is beyond my comprehension. In fact, it keeps the RBA more independent if the government can override them. That's the position of their shadow minister in the other place. They want to side with the Greens. You can wear it. You can wear it, because we expect economic irresponsibility from them, but we expect a little bit better from mainstream political parties.
So Elbow has outed himself as a full-scale neoliberal here, and I'll say that Chalmers had a little cry about it too on ABC Radio National this morning, because he also said, you know, I was talking to Angus Taylor about this for a year, about removing this override power, and he never objected to it, not once. You know, so now, and of course, look, the coalition, why is the coalition responding to this? It's not because they're great people or something, but from the inception of this inquiry at the end of last year, the inquiry and politicians all over the country, thanks to you, our supporters, thanks to other people we've worked with and their networks, have let loose on these politicians. This is the last straw. You're going to take away any government power. The RBA has smashed Australians. Yeah. Look at people holding mortgages. Yeah. And now you're going to say we're going to take away the government's final say that they would only use in the most extreme of circumstances and get rid of it, scrap it?
Well, they're going to use it. Look, if you had a government that was representing the general welfare of the population and not the interests of the private bankers, that wasn't operating from this consensus playbook of neoliberalism, which is, look, neoliberalism goes back to the old liberalism of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, which was basically the British East India Company, slave trading and opium war pushing philosophies or economic policies. It also goes back to the policies of the Enlightenment, right, which meant that you didn't treat people as human beings. I mean, all this woke stuff would never possibly exist in the Enlightenment, because people effectively were treated like animals. And this is why they could justify slave trading and drugging the population, is because this idea that human beings are more than animals, like our philosophy says that human beings are created in the image of the Creator, we're endowed with creative reason, which is, when educated, we can make incredible discoveries of the principles in the universe, use those principles, and we can put man on the moon, the backside of the moon, the south side of the moon, the cold side of the moon, or even on Mars. Right, but that idea is not in the neoliberals' thinking. So everything is contracted to simply profits and controlled by large corporations. I've done a lot of work in the last few days, last few weeks on this, and it makes me sick to think the worst possible thing that's happened in our country is any criticism of neoliberal policy, any breaking from the ranks, any idea that you can say, well, maybe the role of the government is to create policies for the people, is actually And look, the Multipolar Society we wrote about in 1996 was an institution that was brought, that established a number of these think tanks, Centre for Independent Studies. Some of the biggest creeps in the world, like Friedrich von Hayek, were on their board. And these institutes are very sophisticated now. They've got journalists in it, and a lot of the journalists, they're primed to attack anyone, particularly like us, that says, hang on a sec, what's the matter about talking about this idea that government can actually run the economy, that government can have control over the banks? And you get this knee-jerk reaction from economists that are trained in universities that have been brainwashed by this neoliberalism, like Jim Chalmers, you know, who did his thesis on Paul Keating, that was responsible for wrecking the Australian economy through the Campbell report and the Martin reports and so forth, that deregulated the banking system. Right, this guy's completely brainwashed in neoliberal economics. So no wonder he's spitting chips over the fact that his piece of legislation that says, no, we've got to give complete free market to the banks to do what they want, hand over this entire control to central bankers, right, is being resisted because there's a few people in the Liberal Party and in the Labor Party are saying, well, hang on a sec, that's not a good PR issue for us if the Citizens Party gets hold of it, and we did, and therefore we've caused a lot of problems for these guys.
And no doubt the Labor people in the back of their mind are thinking, you know, we both signed up to this, we all agreed to this, and you're breaking from it in a move that's going to be more popular come the next election, and we're still sticking with the policy that's very unpopular, but, you know, we all agreed to this, you can't break the deal, you know? Yeah,
break the deal. You know, break the back of Chifley and Curtin that brought this in. I mean, here you have the two most incredible prime ministers in our history. They brought this in because of exactly the problem of the Great Depression, whereby you had the private bankers dictating monetary policy to the elected government. The elected government wanted to move on policies like creating, in Ted Theodore, creating funds for large-scale public works and so forth, fiduciary credit at that particular time. And the Reserve, the Commonwealth Bank, under the controls of Sir Robert Gibson, says, no, we bloody well won't. We will not exercise the power of what you request because we are representing the private bankers, the Bank of England and so forth. And that's why Curtin and Chifley brought this in the 40s, in order to protect that power. And it's never been used, but it's there and it can keep the RBA very honest.
And, you know, that's why it was so interesting that in this hearing last Thursday, and I felt almost uncomfortable agreeing with, you know, some of these senior figures like Peter Costello, like Bernie Fraser and McFarlane, you know, Reserve Bank heads that we would never be on the same side as. But even they, from a standpoint of having a little bit of distance from being in government, looking back, can see you can't give away government control. And I want to come to some clips here and just to give a bit of a summary overview of the hearing. The senators from all parties really hammered this issue, as you mentioned before. Where did Section 11, this government power, was at the top of their minds. It dominated, I'd say, 85 to 90% of the hearing. And so one of the top questions that the senators kept coming back to was, where did this proposal come from? And of course, no one knew. The only, you know, clues came from the Reserve Bank Review panellists, the two of them that were there on the day, who basically said, oh, it came up in discussions. They were very vague about it until they were questioned in a bit more detail, which we'll come to. But they did reveal the real necessity in their minds for it when they talked about, as we'll see, the threat of politicians going all populist, you know, going all rogue, so to speak, and, you know, demanding interest rates be kept under control or reflecting other popular concerns of the people. So they made clear that that was the real agenda. And then you had these senior statesmen coming in, like Costello and others, saying, you know, you can't have the technocrats in control. You've got this cult of central banking. We can't allow that to dominate. And then discussing, as one of the senators, Liberal Senator Dean Smith, raised the fact that a lot of the RBA review panel's points were based on economic theory as opposed to lived experience, which tells something, as these senior statesmen made clear, quite different. And those statesmen and other leaders defending the role of elected government. And the supreme irony at the end of it all was that the question came back with every witness from a number of senators, well, if Section 11 was removed, how would you resolve a dispute between government and the RBA if it arose? And all of them had to admit in the end that you would have to re-legislate something very similar, if not equivalent, to Section 11 in that case. So why take it out, So let's start with Peter Costello and the cult of central banking. And Costello prefaced these clips I'm going to show here by saying, when he was asked about where did Section 11 come from, and he talked about the fact that this, in the networks of central banking, they're well aware of it, and it comes up every now and again, particularly when there's questions about, are we in line with international standards and rah, rah, rah. So he said this basically was an inquiry in search of a recommendation, and at a certain point, they pulled open the bottom drawer and, Section 11, okay, let's recommend scrapping that. But then he went on discussing how, economists, of course, they're going to push for power, they want power, but the only reason that parliaments would give away that power is if they don't trust themselves.
Does Parliament want to maintain some sovereignty in this area or not? I don't think it's really a matter for central banking, to be frank. It's a matter for Parliament. And I would say to you, you'll always find economists who'll say Parliament should give up its power because they're economists. They believe they should have the power. But I can only think that the Parliament give up its power if it doesn't trust itself. And I don't think that's a very good principle. I do think you'll never hear this from central bankers, obviously, but they do have enormous powers. And if anything, I think they probably don't get enough scrutiny. This idea that we should remove them from all scrutiny, they're not infallible. They make mistakes. The idea of the infallibility of a central bank governor, we can't even criticise them. I've always said I think the press, because they've got such power, the press should be more robust in its criticism of them. I think that'd be a good thing. And I actually think there wasn't enough criticism of what we call the unconventional monetary policy, which was the forward guidance and the bond buying program. If there'd been a bit more, maybe we'd have got some better decisions at that point. I actually think, I'll probably go the other way, I think there should be a bit more scrutiny of the bank at the moment. Now, whether that's done through the parliamentary committees, whether that's done through the press, I think, particularly with what I regard as the failure during the unconventional monetary policy, I think there should have been more scrutiny. You can't remove people from scrutiny when they exercise such enormous powers. So I would say this is where you, senators, this is where the House has got a responsibility and the press has got a responsibility. I think the press has got a responsibility because there tends to be this sort of cult of the central banker. Never attack a central banker. It's a bad thing to do. I think the press has got to get much more inquiring here.
All right, more scrutiny of central banks. Brilliant. Now, Ian Macfarlane, former head of the Reserve Bank himself, now talks about the restrictions on central bank independence.
We have to recognise that central bank independence, a good thing as it is, and no one has promoted it as much as I have, but it's not God-given. It was delegated to the central banks by elected governments because they concluded it would lead to better decision-making. But conflicts can arise, usually small ones. But how would we resolve the situation if there was a really big one, a rare event so far? But at the end of the day, the elected government has to have priority if the issue was big enough. I think we have to accept the elected government is more important than the central bank.
Okay, so governments have to have priority. Here. Now then, Bernie Fraser, another former head of the Reserve Bank, he discussed this idea of having a new monetary policy committee which would be dominated by basically technocrats. And this is where the question of technocrats and, you know, expert economists versus lived experience comes in. So listen to what he had to say.
Touched upon by, I think, some other witnesses, namely the creation of a separate monetary policy committee. It's not so much the separateness that worries me, but the concentration of monetary policy, monetary theory that's envisaged in respect to the committee to make the decisions on interest rates is very much organised around monetary policy and monetary theory. In other words, we're getting close to having a committee of super nerds on monetary theory and monetary policy making decisions on interest rates. And while inflation is very much a monetary phenomenon, the causes of inflation and the consequences of inflation go way beyond monetary theory and monetary policy. So I think another witness touched upon the need to have a board making the decision and have people sitting around the board making those decisions that has a capacity to make judgments and inputs about all the other things that bear upon inflation, quite apart from monetary conditions and demand. You know, we've learned very clearly in recent times about the supply problems, about productivity and competition in industry, and all those kinds of things have very significant implications for inflation. And I think those kinds of people should, or those kinds of skills should be represented around the table that's actually making the decisions on interest rates.
All right, so now in these next bunch of clips, you'll see the reference I made earlier to the Reserve Bank panellists talking about, and the lady here, Renee Fryer-McKibben, is an economist, and her sidekick, Gordon De Brewer, is from the Public Service. But they're talking about how the independence of the central bank has to be protected from populist politics. And also listen to what Renee says when they ask her, when the Senator Dean Smith asks her, you know, we've had all these people with a lot of experience speak against removing Section 11. Have you got anyone equally esteemed on your side? And again, all she can cite is a central banker.
Well, the RBA is operationally independent. It's independent because you guys allow them to be independent. That's a political decision. But they're independent because they have to make difficult decisions and they need to be, I guess, protected from the short-run political process of, populist politics and, the RBA having to make hard decisions is hard sometimes, and they need to be protected as well.
So it's clear in the evidence today that former governors, Mr Fraser and Mr Macfarlane, former Treasurer Mr Costello, third parties like the Australia Institute and ACOS, and then other independent submitters do not support removing Section 11. For our benefit, can you identify for us some equally esteemed people that support the removal of Section 11?
Well, Andy Levin, who was a professor from the US, wrote an in-depth paper on this for us. We accepted that part of his recommendation. We didn't accept all of his recommendations. But there's a lot of academic work that looking at the period of the inflation shocks in the 70s that looked at the role of the independence of a central bank in inflation outcomes, and they found that the more independent a central bank is, the better inflation outcomes are.
So I suppose for me as a lay person, what I'm seeing is a clear delineation between those with lived experience and you've identified an academic. Can you identify? Can you identify someone with perhaps a more practical or lived experience who supports the recommendation in regards to removing Section 11?
So Professor Levin was a member of the US federal system for a long period of time. So that's where he came out.
And probably the reveals, it's the revealed preferences of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank Senator. They're both major central banks that don't have an override power, and that's specifically to ensure their independence.
Thank you.
Under difficult and stressful circumstances.
Now, that question of the populist, an executive government becoming all populist comes up again in this last couple of clips that I want to play, where Senator McKim, at the start here, he has an excellent roundup of the proceedings, and you'll see the response.
The RBA didn't ask for it. That was Ms Bullock has made that clear in Senate estimates last week. The RBA did not ask for this power to be removed. The current governor has said that she's agnostic about it, and also said that the RBA has as much independence as it needs to do its job. You've got now two former governors of the RBA saying not only should it not be removed, but that actually removing it would compromise the independence of the RBA. You've got two of the highest profile former treasurers of the last generations, Mr Costello and Mr Keating, both now publicly opposing the removal of Section 11. Do you still think it's a good idea?
Yes, Senator. But my personal view would be, as panel member, yes, I think I'm balanced, and for the reasons I went through earlier. Just as an observation, there's always a high contestability around monetary policy decisions. So I don't think it's the end of the world. So keeping Section 11 is not the end of the world. Removing it is not a global panacea. It's not going to not solve everything. But what it does do is it shifts the focus of every time the central bank is making a hard decision from contesting that decision from executive decision-making within government as opposed to the parliament. And where you concentrate that always being it's the executive government has to make that decision every time there's a contestable choice or decision by the central bank. You bring that, and that's where that debate has now gone. You bring that form of the debate very directly. You make it an issue for every interest rate decision. Most decisions by central banks on interest rates are right, but almost all of them are very hard. And you've got a highly contested political environment, and that just makes it harder, actually, for the central bank and for executive government. We're not removing the right and power of Parliament to override. We're not recommending that. We can't anyway, but that would be something we would vehemently object to. But actually, putting it always directly into the confrontation between executive government and the central bank is not healthy. The government is the executive. What happens here if you have a populist executive who wants to then every interest rate decision override that interest rate decision because it's not politically convenient? By keeping Section 11, you bring that exercise of populist power into the executive rather than the parliament.
Well, my response to that would be that they are accountable to the people in a way that the board of the RBA is not.
Okay, so yep, he closed it off nicely with this fact that, look, the government is elected.
To go to the polls to the people, yep.
That's right, and that, if you want to call it populist, but there's times, particularly in crisis, where governments have to respond to the people who elected them. Mm-hmm. So you want to write that out of all of Australia's legislation?
We've got a dictatorship, haven't we?
Exactly right. Now, the Liberal Party, the coalition, has heard that point loud and clear, and that's the only reason they're saying they will oppose this legislation. Now, of course, we are yet to see backroom deals, sneaking things through. It looks at least certain that even if the legislation goes through, it likely won't have that Section 11 bit in it. There are other parts of the bill, like the removal of Section 36, which gives the Reserve Bank the power to control the lending policies of banks that could prevent inflating housing bubbles and such like, and also the removal of the RBA's objective of being beholden to the general welfare of the people of Australia, just to focus on employment and inflation, and make it an overarching objective instead. So there's other things in there that should also be removed, and even other things on Monetary Policy Board with concentration of external advisors on that board, etc., that are not good. But at least if Section 11 is removed in itself, that's good. Maybe the government will scrap the whole thing, because the Reserve Bank panel, when it put out its recommendations, did say if there's no bipartisan support for this, we recommend you don't take a legislative approach to making these changes, but basically do it ad hoc behind the scenes. So I would not be surprised if the Albanese government just pulled it and went about it in other ways, which they can do.
One of the biggest issues behind the scenes here, underneath all of this, is the axiom that government should not be any sort of power in the economy whatsoever. Right? Nation states should not exist. This idea of sovereignty should not exist. This is what's underpinning neoliberal policy. And that's what's we're starting to find a reaction against in the population, because people are being screwed by the interest rate rises. There was no necessity to do that. But under neoliberal policies, you've got to protect the banking system, and you've got to do that which protects corporations. And this is the underpinning, the axioms of neoliberalism. So when we talk about neoliberalism, we're not talking about the common good or the general welfare ideas that were embraced by old Labor, which brought these powers like Section 11 and 36 in, where governments could act in the general welfare and the general interest of the population. You're talking about a series of axioms, a series of very strong beliefs that government should have no role in the economy. It should be completely free market. It should be just laissez-faire, at strongest, survival of the fittest economically and so forth. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, read this pamphlet if you want to know more about that, because that's when liberalism was reinvented as neoliberalism. One of the first places it was tried out was under Mussolini in Italy. And, people, when he first made his name on the stage, he was a strong man that said, we've got debt, we've got problems, we've got this, we've got that. This is the approach to deal with it. We have to be hard-handed, and we have to, go with what they called at that time, which one of his advisors had written about, pure economics. So the balance sheet is the bottom line. Forget what happens to the people. At least we'll get out of debt. At least we'll, be viewed well in the eyes of the big banks that won't lend us money otherwise, right? So there's all those threats hanging over them. But in Canberra this week, what we found, and Robbie Barwick is there with Glenn Isherwood, and we wanted to give just a very quick update, but they can give a greater sense of that next week. What we found in Canberra was that all of this that we just described, that you just went through, is on the nose, because the crisis is hitting the population. The population are mobilising, and they're not just getting out there with banners and waving flags or something. They've got ideas and solutions to orient to, which we and our collaborators are providing. And one of those ideas, which we have had discussions about in Canberra this week, is our idea, starting with a postal bank, of actually utilising the power of government to invest in the areas of the economy that need it, to get the economy actually flourishing and moving and put people back to work. Resolving the issue at the same time with postal banking of reviving the regional and rural communities that are dying when the last bank leaves town. And we got, a great advance, a great motion towards getting the legislation for our postal bank tabled in Parliament. And, you come out as a politician and vote against that, you see what you're going to cop. Yep. The spirit of the times is moving in the direction that we have made very, very clear, and we've got a force out there that will fight for it.
Yeah, the Citizens Party, Elisa, we're not just reactionary, right? People say, oh, you're reacting to this, what's going on. No, it's the opposite. We're putting in place policies that have a depth, that have a proof of principle in depth. Now, the whole idea of a post office bank is based upon the original idea of the Commonwealth Bank, which was started in post offices. We're using the footprint that it used to become the most powerful and successful bank that protected Australia over decades. We're going to bring that back. Bring that back. It should never have been sold off. But in the 80s and 90s, we came under this massive attack in this country through likes of the Mont Pelerin Society. They established all these new think tanks. There was a whole new raft of neoliberal thinking. People said, oh, this is great. This must work. But it was an experiment. It was a neoliberal experiment that put people last. And now look, just go and have a look at your power bill. They were supposed to be much lower than they are now. In fact, it's completely the opposite. The privatisation of electricity is blown up in people's faces, but that's the nature of privatisation. When you privatise or take out basic necessary economic infrastructure from the role of government, which can use its powers, right, to make sure that the infrastructure is efficient and so forth, and not subject to all sorts of competition rules, which it is now, that when you take that out of the economy, you destroy the economy by making basic economic infrastructure too expensive. And that's what we're looking at with gas prices. And we should have the cheapest gas in the world. No, we've got the most expensive. We should have cheap electricity. No, we've got the most expensive. Right, so the problem here is the neoliberal ideology, this free trade, I call it the slave trade and opium dope pushing trade philosophy, is what underpins the economics today. And most economists wouldn't even realise that. Because they go with the university stuff, it starts at a certain level, but they don't go and have a look and say, where does this really come from?
Yeah, that's right. But it's failed as a body of thought. It has actually failed, and that's being recognised across the world. And I want to come to our next topic now, because this gets into a living example happening as we speak. Argentina demonstrates neoliberal descent into fascism. So it might seem a paradox to some people that the new Argentine president, Javier Milei, who prides himself on standing for freedom, I mean, he's a libertarian, and yet he's forced, in holding up those beliefs, to literally descend into fascism. And I'll give a bit of a sense of what I mean by that, but just to preface it, so Javier Milei, and he is a politician with an economics degree and master's degrees. He's a devotee of people like Friedrich von Hayek, a founder of the Mont Pelerin Society, who you mentioned earlier, and he's an advocate of dollarising the Argentine economy. In other words, replacing their local currency, the peso, with the dollar. So talk about scrapping sovereignty, but a vibrant advocate of deregulation, privatisation and savage austerity measures to, as I said earlier, get the budget bottom line in hand, stop hyperinflation, all of these things that, as you said, as with the example of deregulation of electricity, doesn't actually work, and it's not working here. We'll give you the figures. But just to preface it, Javier Milei took office on the 10th of December, and then between the 20th and the 27th of December, he introduced two pieces of legislation which would give him unprecedented power. On the 20th of December, he announced the Urgency and Necessity Decree, and then on the 27th December, an omnibus bill called Bases and Starting Points Law for Freedom of Argentines. And he described this as shock policy or shock therapy, which is exactly the policy that destroyed Argentina under the International Monetary Fund, where the IMF would come in and say, we'll lend you money because you absolutely desperately need it, but only if you cut what you're spending on health, cut what you're spending on social services, cut everything, which crushed the economies, and deregulate, privatise, etc. Now, the decree policy overturns 30 laws that include social protections, regulation of trade, protection of consumers and workers, and control of the prices of basic goods, including food, health insurance and rents. It also dictates that all public sector companies will be privatised And that means everything: state airlines, public media, companies that run the country's nuclear reactors, that build satellites, that run scientific work, medical work, the state-run bank, founded in 1891, the state oil company, ports, railroads, energy companies, and public labs. Now, the second bill, the Omnibus Bill, has 664 articles and demands that Congress declare a public emergency in every single sector of the government structure for the purpose of removing those sectors from state control. And that includes economic, financial, fiscal and social security policy, national defence, tariff, energy, sanitation, administrative policy and labour policy. One of the things that it does is criminalise all protests with lengthy jail terms, and it goes as far as to say that any gathering of 3 people in a public place is considered a demonstration. And so if you don't have permission 48 hours in advance from the Ministry of Security, it's illegal.
So much for libertarianism.
Absolutely. Now, fortunately, earlier this month, Millet failed to secure the votes to pass that omnibus bill, and it was sent back to committee. So, you know, he still has to get this stuff through Parliament because we still haven't made the decisions that we've just forestalled here in Australia, fortunately, to give away all these powers completely. But as I said earlier, Mussolini started off in the same way. You know, he was elected and they got things through Parliament. Then at a certain point, they said that the emergency was such that they had to seize power. And again, with Nazi Germany, emergency decrees get enacted outside of parliamentary procedure. But I wanted to give a bit of a sense of what has happened in just some of the figures that have been coming out in recent days and weeks. These are figures of the decline in the economy since Millet was elected on the 10th of December. So poverty has increased by over 10%. So the January figure saw poverty at 57.4%, up from 44.7% at the end of last year. The number of Argentinians that are destitute were at 15% in January, up from 9.6% at the end of 2023.
That's 15% of the entire population. Not 15% of a substrata, but the entire population.
So that's Argentinian citizens absolutely destitute. The food price, you know, this explains why. The food price is up 300% since he took office, and of course his solutions were meant to, you know, stop all of that happening. The peso has been devalued 50% against the dollar so far. And again, he's just using that as the excuse to dollarise.
I found that very interesting, Elisa, because Lyndon LaRouche, you know, statesman and physical economist Lyndon LaRouche, who we've been associated with for many years, of course he died in 2019, he made some comments about this exact process of, you know, dollarising people's country's peso, currency. He made the point when the Ecuadorian government was looking at doing this. I don't know whether they did or not. I haven't been able to find out whether that in fact took place. But he basically called it slavery and genocide of the nation state, because you're giving away your pure sovereignty. Now, the same economist that was advising the Ecuadorian government is now advising Millet. So the point is that this represents it'll represent actual genocide for the people of Argentina. And I find it staggering that a country like Argentina, that used to be one of the wealthiest countries in South America, has now become down to this. And it rings the alarm bells in my mind very easily. If it can happen to Argentina, it can happen in Australia.
Our economy is often being compared to Argentina.
And that's the problem. And look, the difference, though, is us as a political party representing alternative solutions and getting people to say, look, wake up, look at history, look how you can actually solve these problems by policies other than these neoliberal Mont Pelerin society policies of slavery and, you know, free trade and everything like that.
Now, additionally, interest rates have gone up to 133%. Inflation for January is up to 254% per year. Of course, that means wages and pensions, you know, won't get you anywhere, won't buy you anything. And this is before a lot of so that inflation is before a lot of the deregulation, because in early March the government is set to deregulate water, electricity and gas. And as you showed in Australia, that's not going to put the prices down, because they're giving power to, we, on an earlier show, Citizens Report show, we featured the video of Milei talking to the World Economic Forum, where he spoke in defence of monopolies. And that's what you have concentrating their power when you deregulate. And that's what you get. Now, the Ministry of Human Capital has cut off deliveries to food kitchens, the provision of cancer drugs to hospitals. These are things that are really impacting people in the last weeks, and strikes are therefore growing. So there was a big strike on the 24th of January, there were more in February, and there are many more planned. There's also a big backlash from numerous governors of the various provinces, one of which is threatening to cut off deliveries of oil and gas because the federal government has stopped sending money from the federal budget that is usually allocated to the provinces. So, you know, by him saying they're a very big state for production of oil and gas, by him cutting that off, is going to have huge consequences as well. And I was going to add to this, you know, look at the protests taking place all over Europe, which are growing by the day, and not just a protest against these kind of neoliberal policies, but against another variety or flavour of those policies, which are green reforms, where they're trying to impose upon farmers in particular things in the name of the environment that are crushing them as well. So you've got a real explosion of dissent across the globe against these neoliberal policies.
Yeah, exactly, Elisa. Look, I just want to come back to our history again, because I think it's really illustrative of what was done in Victoria, right? Because you had this Mont-Pelerin Society, which has set up these think tanks all around the world. There's about 550 of them now in 100 countries. In other words, they promote this neoliberal agenda, small government, you know, deregulate. Everything that you've just said that Milei is doing is what they recommend, except it's hidden. And it was deliberately hidden because that was their agenda. They said, we're going to set up all these societies around the world, but we're not going to talk about free market, free trade or free market economics, because that might cause a bit of a reaction. Well, they've been very successful in the sense of setting up these institutes all around the world, but they've also been unsuccessful in the sense that the irony is that, you know, Argentina was going to join the BRICS, and it was going to be BRICS 11, but now it's BRICS 10. But a majority of countries around the world are now going with, or a lot of countries around the world see what's being done when you dollarise your economy or get too close to the United States, where the dollar is actually no longer being as popular as it used to. But so they're going away from that en masse around the world. Now, here in Australia, we had an operation run against the Whitlam government, right, which was to stop us from owning our own resources. Right, he had a policy of buy back the farm. The Mont-Pelerin Society back in the 70s, that was the first target here in Australia, and it was done through a guy by the name of Dr. Michael Porter, who was a member of the Mont-Pelerin Society. He was one of just 14 Australians that were members of the Mont-Pelerin Society, and he was a very close associate. He was of Friedrich von Hayek personally, and he was part of the Central Policy Review Committee, a Whitlam think tank at the time, and what he said was that when Whitlam or any of his ministers came in, notably Rex O'Connor, when they would come into this committee with ideas, they would bring in these huge plans for water projects, rail policy proposals, but then Porter and the CPRC just trashed them and went with ours. We evaluated them, we stripped them and left them as empty bones. This crazy Connor plan of borrowing billions to buy back the farm, so what? We scrapped a lot. Whitlam put them in the cupboard and we just stripped them to the bare bones. We oversaw every policy proposal. So this is the neoliberal agenda back in the Whitlam era, and that was back in the 70s. And then you had an acceleration. You had the establishment in 1976 of the Centre for Independent Studies, right, by Greg Lindsay. They openly promote these policies. Go and look at their website. Look at they praise von Hayek and all the neoliberal economists there. But see, that's not talked about. because it's not supposed to be. Anton Fisher and a guy by the name of Major Smedley that were in the Institute for Public Affairs in London, which was the premier Thatcher think tank of the 1970s and 1980s, basically said that, like I said before, you can't talk about what we actually represent because it would be, and I was saying, a bit repulsive to the general population. Well, what you see coming out today is the revolt against this neoliberal agenda.
Yeah.
But what is very important is that people know that this was this neoliberalism was not something that was always been part of Australian history. It was brought in the mid-70s by this Mont Pelerin Society crowd, and it destroyed the type of economics that was being promoted by Curtin and Chifley.
Yeah, no.
Because go back, look at the post-war projects of Curtin and Chifley. The Snowy Mountain scheme was the only one that got built, but there was dozens of these. You come forward to the 70s when Whitlam was proposing building regional cities and large-scale infrastructure projects. Rex Connor did a lot of good as the resources minister at the time, but the backlash was so great by the institutions that were being supported and run by the Mont Pelerin Society and these neoliberal think tanks that after a while no one wanted to stick their head up and talk about policies, nation-building policies. So there's a long history. But the Citizens Party's been around since the 1980s. We were established in Baramba, in Kingaroy in the 1980s based upon the recognising that these sorts of policies was what's destroying our country. That's why Nolan, myself, and my wife and I and 3 other blokes, we set up the Citizens Electoral Council at that time, specifically because we had to find a solution to this policy direction. And now look, 36 years later, we have every, particularly from your austerity pamphlet there, which people should ring in and get a copy of, we know how this organism smells, and it doesn't smell very good at all.
Yeah.
And we're very happy to talk to anyone, particularly politicians, our leadership, about how you can get the smell out of their nostrils and actually build this country, because it is foul. But the good news is that we have solutions. We've published them many times. We provide the alternative to what unfortunately these Argentinians are now going through. We're not going to let our country get into that state.
We don't have to go that way, and we have the chance to do it now, and defeating this RBA reform bill can be the first victory in doing it. So stay tuned for more marching orders on what we want you to do. We'll see what happens in the next 24, 48 hours, and next week we'll have more to say about it. But we can win this one. So thanks for all your support in getting us this far. Thanks for tuning in. That's all we've got time for today. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And see you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.